May 334 BCE, the banks of the Granicus River, northwestern Asia Minor. Picture this. You're standing on the eastern bank of a fast-moving river. The water is cold, running swift from the spring snowmelt off Mount Ida. The bank behind you rises steeply, churned into mud by 10,000 horses in the boots of infantry who have been positioning since before noon. Across the water on the opposite bank, an army is forming. You can see the glint of their helmets catching the afternoon sun. You can hear the sound of their horses moving into line, and riding at the front of that army, across the river, is a 22-year-old king who has never lost a battle. You are a Persian commander. You have spent the last week debating how to stop him. You have the high ground. You have the river working in your favor. You have cavalry that is the finest in Asia, and infantry that has held the line for the greatest empire the world has ever known. Every military instinct you have tells you that what is about to happen should not be possible. The young king enters the water. This is the Granicus River. This is where Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire began. Not at Gaugamela, where Darius III fled and the empire broke. Not at Issus, where Alexander first looked across a battlefield and found the king himself. Here, at a river in northwestern Asia Minor in the spring of 334 BCE, where a Macedonian army crossed into Persian territory for the first time and proved that the campaign was real. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what happened at the Granicus, why the Persian commanders made the decisions they made, how close Alexander came to dying before his empire had even begun, and why a single cavalry charge across a cold river changed the ancient world forever. To understand the Granicus, you need to understand what Alexander was inheriting and what he was risking. In 336 BCE, Philip II of Macedon was assassinated at his own daughter's wedding celebration. He was killed before he could launch the campaign he had spent years preparing, a full-scale invasion of Persian-controlled Asia Minor in retaliation for Xerxes' destruction of Greece a century and a half earlier. Philip had already sent an advance force across the Hellespont. He had already begun the political and military groundwork. The campaign existed. The army existed. The plan existed. What did not exist was a king old enough or strong enough to carry it forward. Alexander was 20 years old when his father died. Within 2 years, he had done things that would have defined most rulers' entire careers. He had crushed a revolt in Thessaly by marching his army through mountain passes at night and appearing behind the rebels before they knew he had moved. He had destroyed the city of Thebes so completely, sparing only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, that the rest of Greece went very quiet very quickly. He had secured his northern borders against the Thracian and Illyrian tribes that had spent generations testing Macedonian strength. He had done all of this before he was 22. Now he stood at the edge of Asia. The army he led across the Hellespont in the spring of 334 BCE was not enormous by the standards of what would come later, approximately 35,000 men in total. Around 13,000 Macedonian heavy infantry, the backbone of the force, organized into the famous phalanx formations that Philip had spent decades perfecting. Roughly 7,000 allied Greek infantry contributed by the Corinthian League, the political alliance Alexander had inherited, and in whose name the campaign was theoretically being fought as a pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia. About 5,000 Greek mercenary infantry, who fought for pay rather than politics. And critically, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 cavalry, including the elite companion cavalry that Alexander himself led in battle, the shock force that would define his tactical approach for the next 11 years. It was a professional, highly trained, magnificently disciplined army. It was also crossing into an empire with 20 times its resources, 10 times its manpower reserves, and every logistical and geographic advantage that comes with fighting on your own territory. The Persians knew he was coming. They had been watching the Hellespont crossing, and they had been preparing. The regional satraps of northwestern Asia Minor gathered their forces and their commanders at a council near the city of Zelea, a day's march east of the Granicus. And at that council, a debate took place that would shape everything that followed. The man making the most sense in that council was not Persian. His name was Memnon of Rhodes. He was a Greek mercenary commander in Persian service, one of the most experienced and capable military minds of his generation, and he understood Alexander better than the Persian satraps did. What Memnon argued at Zelea was strategically correct. The Persians completely ignored him. Do not fight Alexander in open battle, Memnon told them. Do not give him a field engagement, destroy the crops, burn the supplies, strip the countryside of everything his army could use to feed itself or sustain its march, fall back. Make him chase an enemy he cannot catch across territory that is working against him. An army of 35,000 men, deep in hostile territory with no supply line and no food, does not need to be defeated in battle. It starves itself to death. The satraps rejected this advice almost immediately. The idea of burning their own land, their own farms, their own cities, the territory they governed and profited from and were responsible for protecting, was politically and personally unacceptable. Beyond the practical objections, there was something deeper at work. These were men of the Persian aristocracy, men whose identity was bound up in the tradition of facing enemies directly, of cavalry charges and personal courage and the kind of warfare that built reputations. The idea of retreating before a young Macedonian king without striking a blow felt like surrender before the battle had started. They would fight. They would find a good defensive position, and they would stop Alexander before he could penetrate further into Persian territory. They chose the Granicus River. The river itself was their first weapon. In May of 334 BCE, the Granicus was running high and fast with snowmelt. It was not so wide that it could not be crossed, but it was not so narrow that crossing it was simple either. The current was strong enough to pull horses sideways. The eastern bank, the Persian side, rose steeply in places, offering defenders the high ground that infantry and cavalry always want when an enemy is advancing uphill from water. Any army trying to cross would be doing so in disorder, fighting the current with one part of its attention while the defenders above used every other part against it. The Persian commanders deployed along the eastern bank with deliberate care. Their cavalry, the strongest element of their force, was placed at the front along the riverbank itself, positioned to strike the Macedonian forces the moment they emerged from the water. Behind the cavalry stood a substantial force of Greek mercenary infantry, perhaps 10,000 men, experienced, heavily armed, and capable of the kind of sustained close-quarters fighting that would be decisive if the Persian cavalry managed to disrupt the Macedonian crossing. It was a defensible position. Memnon, who disagreed with the decision to fight but fought anyway because that was his job, took his place in the line. The Persian command structure at the Granicus was unusual in one important respect. There was no single commander. The satraps commanded their own contingents, with the overall decision-making distributed across multiple powerful men who had spent their careers operating independently. They agreed on the defensive position. They agreed on the deployment. What they did not have was one mind that could read the battle as it developed and respond to Alexander with the same speed and decisiveness that Alexander brought to everything he did. That asymmetry would matter before the afternoon was over. The Macedonian army arrived at the western bank of the Granicus in the early afternoon. Alexander's second-in-command, the veteran general Parmenion, assessed the situation and recommended against an immediate crossing. The position was strong. The hour was late. The sensible thing to do was make camp on the western bank, rest the army through the night, and cross at dawn with full light and full discipline, denying the Persians the advantage of striking a disordered force emerging from the water in fading light. It was the correct tactical advice. It was the advice of an experienced commander who understood risk management and who had watched armies destroyed by exactly the kind of impulsive aggression that the moment seemed to be demanding. Alexander rejected it. What Alexander understood, in a way that Parmenion's considerable experience could not quite override, was that this moment was not primarily about military mechanics. It was about meaning. He had crossed the Hellespont. He had made the crossing as a deliberate act of historical theater, stopping at Troy to make offerings at the tomb of Achilles, his personal hero, to frame the entire campaign as the continuation of a story that Greeks had been telling for centuries. He had come to Asia to begin a conquest. Waiting on the western bank of the Granicus overnight, making camp, letting the Persians watch him hesitate, sent a message that no amount of tactical prudence could compensate for. He was Alexander. He did not wait. He reorganized his forces for the crossing. The companion cavalry, his personal strike force, was positioned on the right wing under his direct command. The phalanx infantry was arrayed in the center, with allied cavalry protecting the left under Parmenion. Light cavalry and infantry were deployed to screen the flanks and support the crossing at multiple points, preventing the Persians from concentrating everything against the main effort. Then Alexander put on his armor. He placed a helmet with white plumes on his head, plumes that made him visible across the entire battlefield, that made absolutely certain that no one on either bank could watch the crossing and lose track of where the king of Macedon was. He was not just leading the charge, he was making sure that everyone saw him leading it. He entered the water. The crossing was violent from the first moment. The current pulled at horses and men. The steep bank on the Persian side meant that the Macedonian cavalry was climbing out of the water into a wall of Persian horsemen who had the advantage of dry ground, momentum, and elevation. The fighting at the riverbank was immediate and close and brutal. Persian cavalry slashed downward at men still half in the water. Macedonians drove upward with their shorter cavalry lances, trying to clear enough space on the bank to get fully onto dry ground and form something resembling a fighting line. In the initial chaos, Alexander drove directly toward the center of the Persian line. This was always his tactical signature, the personal charge at the point of maximum resistance, the willingness to be where the fighting was hardest and the outcome was most uncertain. He was not directing this battle from a safe distance. He was in it. The Persian commanders saw him coming, and several of them made a decision that would prove catastrophic. Instead of allowing the cavalry battle to develop on its own terms, letting the defensive position in the terrain do the work that Memnon had always trusted them to do, The Persian nobility focused on Alexander personally. Kill the king. End the campaign before it began. If Alexander fell at the Granicus, the army would have no one who could replace what he was, and the invasion would collapse. It was not an unreasonable idea. It was, in fact, the correct strategic instinct. Alexander himself was the campaign. Without him, there was no campaign. The problem was execution. A Persian commander named Mithridates led a wedge of cavalry directly at Alexander. A Macedonian officer cut Mithridates down. Then Rusaces, another Persian noble, rode at Alexander and struck him with a sword that cut through his helmet and drew blood from the scalp beneath. Alexander drove his lance through Rusaces before he could strike again. A third Persian nobleman, Spithridates, came at Alexander from behind with his arm raised for a killing blow. He never delivered it. A Macedonian officer named Clitus, known to history as Clitus the Black, reached Spithridates a heartbeat before the blade came down and cut off his sword arm at the shoulder. Clitus saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River. The two men who would later have the catastrophic falling out that ended with Alexander killing Clitus in a drunken rage were, in this moment, the most important partnership on the battlefield. Alexander survived. And with his survival, the momentum of the entire engagement shifted. The Macedonian cavalry had crossed in enough force now to fight on the eastern bank without the river working against them. The phalanx infantry was crossing behind, forming up with the discipline that Philip had spent 20 years building into them. The Persian cavalry, which had been attempting to hold the bank against a crossing that physics and Macedonian determination had made inevitable, began to feel the pressure of a coordinated force that was no longer disorganized by the water. The Persian cavalry broke, not all at once, not in panic. But unit by unit, the aristocratic horsemen who had ridden to the Granicus to stop Alexander began to disengage, to pull back, to yield ground that they had held for the first violent minutes of the battle. When the cavalry went, the structure of the Persian defensive position went with it, which left Memnon's Greek mercenary infantry standing on the eastern bank without cavalry support, facing the full weight of the Macedonian army that had just completed its crossing. What happened next has been debated by historians ever since, because it reveals something about Alexander that sits uncomfortably beside the image of the brilliant, merciful conqueror. The Greek mercenaries, surrounded and abandoned by the cavalry that had been supposed to support them, reportedly attempted to surrender, or at least to negotiate terms. Alexander refused. His forces attacked the mercenaries and killed most of them. A small number were taken prisoner and sent back to Macedonia to work in the mines. The decision was almost certainly political rather than personal. These were Greek soldiers fighting for Persia against a campaign that Alexander had framed as a pan-Hellenic crusade. Their existence was a living contradiction of his narrative. Letting them surrender and walk away intact, to fight again for whoever would pay them, was a message Alexander could not afford to send. They died at the Granicus not because Alexander was merciless, but because their survival would have cost him something he needed more than their lives. The battle was over before evening. Persian casualties among the cavalry and commanders were severe. The satraps who had dismissed Memnon's advice paid for it personally. Several were killed in the fighting, others fled. The Greek mercenary force was destroyed as a fighting unit. Macedonian losses were remarkably light, given the circumstances of the crossing, though the men who fell, several dozen cavalry and a small number of infantry, were honored by Alexander with a care and deliberateness that he maintained throughout his entire career. He commissioned bronze statues of the companion cavalry who died at the Granicus, made by one of the finest sculptors of the age, and sent them home to Macedonia. He also sent 300 suits of Persian armor to Athens, with an inscription that made his political message explicit. Alexander, son of Philip and the Greeks, except the Lacedaemonians, won these from the barbarians inhabiting Asia. Sparta, which had refused to join his campaign and whose military tradition made it constitutionally incapable of fighting under anyone else's command, was pointedly excluded from the dedication. The victory at the Granicus did something that no military calculation could fully capture. It proved that the campaign was real. An army had crossed from Europe into Asia and fought a Persian force on Persian ground and won. The Greek cities of Asia Minor began to recalculate their positions almost immediately. Many opened their gates as Alexander marched south along the Aegean coast. The psychological weight of Persian imperial power, the assumption of inevitability that had kept city-states compliant for generations, cracked the moment the news from the Granicus spread. Memnon survived the battle and continued fighting. He retreated and organized a naval counteroffensive that briefly threatened Alexander's supply lines and communication with Greece. For a period in 334 and 333 BCE, he represented the most serious strategic threat to the entire campaign. Then he died of illness during the siege of Mytilene in 333 BCE, and with him died the only Persian strategic mind that had consistently understood what Alexander was and how to fight him. The conquest continued south and east, city after city, battle after battle. 2 years after the Granicus, at a narrow coastal plain near a city called Issus, Alexander would finally see Darius III across a battlefield and drive straight at him, and the King of Kings would turn his chariot and run, leaving behind his family, his treasury, and whatever remained of his credibility as the ruler of the ancient world. But all of that began here, at a river in spring flood, on a May afternoon when a 22-year-old king rejected his best general's sensible advice, put on a helmet with white plumes so nobody could miss him, and rode into cold water toward a defended bank with the full weight of the Persian Empire waiting on the other side. He came out the other side. Everything that followed, Issus, Gaugamela, Persepolis, the march into Bactria, the crossing of the Hindu Kush, the banks of the Indus, 11 years of the most extraordinary military campaign the ancient world ever produced. Every city opened, every army broken, every frontier pushed beyond what anyone had imagined was possible. All of it traces back to a single moment on the Granicus River when Alexander entered the water and the ancient world held its breath. He was 22 years old, and he had never lost a battle. He never would.